Hi, this is John Adamson, the Rehab and Documentation Guru, and today we're going to look at a hoax, I believe a hoax, that's being perpetrated by the American Medical Association, in which they're saying that 96% of MDs have taken the fairy dust. Now, recently the AMA published a study of fairy dust compliance amongst doctors. Now, the next is a quote from them. This is their methodology. The AMA developed the survey questionnaire, and WebMD programmed and fielded the 5 to 7 minute survey through their physician panel. The survey was fielded from June 3rd to June 8th, 2021. The sample size was 301 participants, and there was a mix of them. 150 of that mix were primary care physicians in, as you can see, the following fields. There was 151 specialists, which were including all other specialties. Their conclusion was, based on the survey they did, that 96% of physicians had been fully fairy dusted for the virus which shall not be named. Now, it's important to keep in mind some statistics when we look at the fairy dust survey by the American Medical Association. As of March of 2020, there were just over 1 million professionally active doctors in the United States. Now, as of 2016, which is the last stat that I could find, the AMA membership was approximately 240,000, according to Wikipedia. There's an earlier study from 2011 that I was able to find where the membership was around 216,000. One thing that's of concern is that there is a significant minority that are expected to be students and retired physicians. So it's been estimated, and this you can find on NIH's website, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% of practicing U.S. doctors now belong to the American Medical Association. And that's taken, obviously, from some British researcher that did that survey based on the spelling of those words. Now, the survey itself, again, had 301 participants. There's no mention of virologists being sampled. The 151 specialists are not differentiated in the study of the survey by the AMA. And the format of the study was a voluntary participation, which meant it was non-randomized. Now, some information that you might want to consider when we're looking at the typical respondent in the survey being a doctor, some things to consider about their coursework. And this is an example of the coursework by Boston University's medical school. First year, they have a course on virology. The second year, they do some general coursework in disease and therapy. But in the third and fourth year of medical school, they're doing about 4 to 8 week courseworks on different specialties, which does not include virology. Then they go through 3 years of residency, and some of them even go on to fellowship. So by the time they're a practicing MD, it's been about 5 or 6 years since they had specific coursework that would have targeted the topic of virology. So let's look at some math. So 301 sample size of physicians compared to 240,000 members of the AMA, some of which has been established would be students and some would be retired physicians. So what that means is in this study, approximately 0.13% of all the AMA members responded. Now, if we assume a total active physician group of 1 million physicians, and that's on the low side, those 301 physicians that were actually surveyed represent just 0.03% of all physicians. So remember what the conclusion is. 96% of all physicians have taken the fairy dust based on a sampling of 0.03% of all physicians. Now, another thing to keep in mind is what's called the Pareto principle. This Pareto principle is well established as being across the board for all sorts of different studies of participation, whether it's in organizations or schools or even potentially surveys. And the Pareto principle basically indicates that 20% of people do 80% of the work, and the remaining 80% cover the remaining 20% of work. So it might be safe to say that only about 20% of AMA members, maybe a little bit more, are very active in looking at surveys coming their way, reading articles from the publications, things like that. The other thing to keep in mind in the math of looking at the survey is that we don't know. We just don't know if any virologists participated in the survey. Some other considerations would include what's known as survey response bias. A survey being used for a study is known to have impaired reliability and validity. In fact, among different types of studies, the survey is one of the weakest research tools. Another consideration is that on average, doctors are working 51.4 hours per week after their residency. That can be lower, it can be higher. They do note that's a decrease in the number of hours worked by doctors in previous years. And one article I looked at noted that more and more physicians are looking at being a doctor as a vocation rather than a lifestyle, which means that their number of hours worked has decreased, but as they try to balance work and family life. Here's an interesting study I came across, a little bit concerning. It's been estimated that approximately 3 to 16% of practicing physicians are impaired, and another 10% incompetent. That's a little bit scary. There's the article you can look at. So it calls into question their rational capabilities. However, of course, the average doctor's IQ is a bit higher than the typical average. In fact, amongst jobs, physicians do tend to have the highest average IQ. But even then, this average falls well below, especially on the lower end, genius level. And here's the website. And I already mentioned this about surveys. So what are some potential conclusions we can glean from this study? Well, number one is that the American Medical Association took an extremely small sample of an even smaller sample of physicians to come up with the conclusion that 96% of all doctors have partaken of the fairy dust. And that really calls into question that percentage. Also, we know that doctors are smart, but just like anybody, they're going to be subject to loss of knowledge over time without consistent study in that area. So they're going to be subject to, just like the rest of us, being fed information by the so-called experts in fairy dust. Also, as people too, they're going to be subject to lack of knowledge in a particular area. If it's not their focus of expertise, we wouldn't expect them to have much knowledge in that area. specialization in the medical field is tremendous, and you don't generally find a jack of all trades in the medical field. Doctors are also going to be subject to, like all people, biases. And one bias might be without critical thinking, trusting data they're being fed. They also, just like everybody, but perhaps more so because of their long hours, don't always have the time to study in fields they're not expert in. In fact, like any specialist, they're going to tend to focus in areas of their clinical expertise. And there is something that's really consistent with all people. All people, regardless of what their background is, have a willingness to accept reports that are repeated enough. And I would encourage you to check out this particular study that's mentioned right here on this slide. Well, folks, there is going to be more to come as we address some logical fallacies in the future, where we're going to look at two appeals that are being used right now that are logical fallacies in the whole fairy dust discussion. And that would be the appeal to authority and the popular appeal, which, by the way, the American Medical Association's study falls into those categories. Anyway, this is John Adamson, the Rehab and Documentation Guru. I hope you've enjoyed this little presentation, and I hope you have a great night. Take care. God bless.